This is Masada, an amazingly luxurious palace and an almost impregnable mountain fortress. Built by Herod the Great as a winter getaway, it was built with Roman power and ingenuity, but later it became the last weapon used by the Jews to resist Roman domination after the destruction of the temple in AD 70. This engineering marvel is amazing both in its construction and destruction. Today, it stands as one of the most powerful symbols of Jewish pride and nationalism. Let's examine the violent collision between Roman military might and Jewish conviction. But as we do, let's look for lessons that will help us in our own battle against the forces of darkness. Masada is a desert plateau rising 1,300 feet above the Dead Sea. Shaped like a diamond, the plateau is about 1,800 feet long from north to south and about 890 feet from east to west. From about 37 to 31 BC, Herod the Great carried out one of his greatest building projects here. The fortress served as both a winter retreat and a safe haven from enemies during political turbulence. The fortress included two huge palaces with a multitude of storerooms, baths, and other buildings necessary to carry on life on a desert mountain. One palace was built on the northern end of the plateau, with three magnificent levels terraced into the narrow end of the mountain. The verandas offered sweeping views of the Dead Sea and the surrounding desert. More importantly, anyone approaching the mountain would be visible for miles before even reaching the foot of the mountain.
Well, when the Romans annexed Palestine in 63 BC, they eventually appointed an Idumean governor named Herod to be the king over what was this very tumultuous territory. Now, Herod was one of Rome's most loyal client kings, and so he wasn't really all that well liked by many of the Jews. In fact, to try to endear himself to this very tumultuous place that Rome controlled, Herod engaged in a massive building program for the whole country, which included things like an artificial harbor at Caesarea. It included the building of Roman aqueducts, the expansion of the temple complex, and of course, the building of this beautiful and this ornate fortress palace at Masada.
Visitors today marvel at the amazing craftsmanship and artistry of the buildings so far from civilization. Beautiful tile mosaics are still in place from more than 2,000 years ago. Most of the walls were covered with plaster. Many of the rooms also boasted frescoes in a modern Roman style.
Roman culture and influence at the time that Herod lived was enormous. Masada was actually constructed at a time when Roman architecture and engineering were at their peak. The massive and decadent building projects of the Greco-Roman world had made their way to Palestine, and Masada, in many ways, represented all of the luxuries of a grand Roman hotel, but in the middle of a desert, situated uniquely atop this seemingly impregnable fortress.
With the luxuries provided at such an unreachable place, the greatest engineering feat of Masada was its water containment system. On the banks of the Dead Sea, Masada sees less than 3 inches of rain in an entire year. During the summer, daytime temperatures average in the triple digits Fahrenheit. The peaks of the Jewish mountains to the west see much more rainfall than Masada. Part of this rain drains toward Masada and the Dead Sea. The chalky ground refuses to absorb much of the water, causing flash flooding near the Dead Sea, sending huge amounts of water to Masada and the Dead Sea every year. Herod's engineers built 2 dams and gorges near the western side of Masada. They built 2 aqueducts to carry the water from the dams into cisterns carved into the side of Masada directly into the rock. The aqueducts and cisterns were positioned over precipices that were unapproachable from the ground below. The underground cisterns had a system of 12 different tanks that could hold up to 1 million gallons of water, enough for 1,000 people to hold out for 10 years. Here are 2 of the water cisterns carved into the rock inside the mountain of Masada. These steps descend inside the rock, also carved out of the rock, so they can't be seen by spies or invading armies below. The water was carried from the lower cisterns to the upper cisterns and ultimately to the top of the mountain for people, but also for swimming pools and baths. They were carried by pack animals, but mostly slaves. The number of slaves required to maintain life on this desert mountain boggles the mind. Much of Masada's construction was designed for military defense. The entire plateau of Masada was ringed by a double casemate wall. The wall consisted of an outer wall with an inner wall. Perpendicular walls ran between the 2 walls, creating casemates or inner rooms. The outer wall was more than 5 feet thick and over 20 feet high, in addition to being built on top of a 300-foot cliff.
The name Masada comes from a word meaning mountain stronghold or fortress, and Herod's palace certainly fits this description. It was incredibly secure, and the only means of reaching the fortress was by a steep, narrow trail called the Snake Path. A small garrison of men could defend it against a much larger force, and we see this during the siege of Masada by the Roman 10th Legion. Now, Herod was utterly paranoid about defending himself against his enemies. But the one foe none of us can escape is our own mortality. And in 4 BC, his rule came to an end after a slow and excruciating death caused by kidney disease and gangrene. In fact, it was so agonizing, Josephus records that Herod attempted to commit suicide.
After the death of Herod the Great in about 4 BC, Masada became an outpost for the Roman army. In about AD 66, a group of Jewish rebels known as the Zealots took control of the fortress. One of Jesus' 12 apostles was referred to as Simon the Zealot in Luke 6:15 and Acts 1:13. Generally, the term zealot referred to Jews who were willing to use violence to defend their beliefs and homeland. They played a leading role in the Jewish rebellion from AD 66 to 73. After the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, Masada became the last Jewish stronghold in the country and the final flashpoint for the Jewish rebellion. In about AD 72, the Romans sent the governor of Judea, Flavius Silva, along with the 10th Legion, to reclaim Masada from the Zealots. This included about 8,000 soldiers plus slaves, most of whom were Jews. Silva built a 2.5-mile wall around the entire plateau to impede escape and resupply of the Jews. He divided his army into 8 camps. The remains of their fortifications can still be seen today from the top of the mountain.
The siege of Masada occurred around AD 73. By this time, the Romans controlled all of Palestine, and that includes the biggest prize of all, the beloved capital city of Jerusalem. That city and the temple had been completely overthrown. Now all that would be left was this isolated, insignificant desert outpost containing Jewish families and a small band of Jewish zealots. Someone might ask, well, why would Silva show up with the entire 10th Legion in the middle of a scorching and lifeless desert? Well, for one, it sent a strong message that Rome would not tolerate resistance, no matter how large or small. Second, it was a means of reinforcing and even showcasing the siege tactics against what many considered to be an unconquerable fortress. Silva wasn't going to allow the famed fortress palace of Masada to go down in history as having thwarted the Romans.
When General Silva arrived, he found a ridge that ran with a sharp crest on the western side of the plateau, not quite to the top of the mountain. Silva decided to turn that ridge into a ramp. The ridge's crest was far too narrow for heavy siege towers or for many soldiers to gather en masse. The Romans hauled in material to build a road on top of the spiny ridge. The road raised the ridge more than 16 feet in the middle and even more at the edges. Investigators estimate the finished road was about 50 feet wide. At the top, the road came to about 40 feet below the top of the mountain. To reach the top of the mountain and to breach the walls, the Romans built a magnificent siege tower. The tower probably stood about 70 feet high and was probably about 30 feet wide at the bottom. On top of the tower, the Romans put catapults and archers to attack the Jews on Masada. Just below the top platform, a huge battering ram swung from ropes. The Romans used the battering ram to destroy the stone wall at the edge of the plateau.
Well, we can only imagine what the Jews at the top of Masada might have been thinking as they were watching their Jewish countrymen who were forced to build this siege ramp and this battering ram to be used to come into their fortress and break through that wall. Masada, what might have seemed to them before as this impregnable fortress and this virtual safe house from the Romans, was now a fortress of misplaced faith. And with the building of that siege ramp, Masada was now showing signs that maybe it just might be overthrown.
From this vantage point, the Jews watch as the Romans take a spiny ridge and turn it into a highway. They watch the Romans as they assemble a mighty siege tower at the bottom of the hill, with a monstrous battering ram hanging from the top of the tower. Understanding what is about to happen, the Jews devise an ingenious strategy to counteract the Roman attack. Masada had numerous buildings with stone walls, but roofs built with wooden beams. The Jews dismantled over 90% of their roofs to extract the wooden beams. The Jews gathered thousands of beams 13 feet long and hundreds of beams about 7 feet long. The long beams were stacked on top of each other with their ends abutting against the outer stone wall at the top of the Roman ramp. This stack ran a length of about 75 feet and rose to a height of about 25 feet. About 12 feet inside the inner end of the first stack of beams, the Jews built another stack of the shorter beams. Between the two stacks, the Jews filled the space with rocks and dirt, constructing an earthen rampart between the stacks of beams. When the Roman battering ram begins to demolish the outer wall, it only solidifies the wooden wall. The battering ram drives the beams into the earth on the other side. The new wall is virtually immune to a battering ram, but the Romans are not easily discouraged. When General Silva realizes that he's battering a wall of wooden beams into an earthen rampart, he quickly changes strategy. The battering ram falls silent. The Romans shoot flaming arrows into the beams. Soon, flames can be seen from the Roman camp below, and the wind carries the flames into the interior of the fortress. The next morning, the Romans pour through the opening with swords drawn, ready for a fierce battle. Instead, silence. No arrows, no swords, no burning oil. Only a clear spring morning with several buildings on fire.
On the last night before the fall of Masada, when the Jews saw the reinforcement wall burning, they knew that their cause was lost. According to Josephus, Eleazar ben Yair, the Jewish leader, he delivered an impassioned speech to the entire group of nearly 1,000 people. In his Jewish wars, Josephus records what he says was part of Yair's speech.
Let our wives die unabused, our children without knowledge of slavery, preserving our freedom as a glorious winding sheet. But first let our possessions and the whole fortress go up in flames. It will be a bitter blow to the Romans, that I know. One thing let us spare, our food. It will bear witness when we are dead to the fact that we perished, not through want, but because we chose death, rather than slavery. As the Roman soldiers fled the mountaintop, they find only dead bodies. In one of the water cisterns, they finally find 2 women and 3 small children who are alive. From these 5 survivors, they learn the story of the Zealots' last hours on Masada. The Jews saw suicide as a deplorable death. The Jews of Masada found an alternative to this disgrace. Each man was charged with killing his own family. 10 men were chosen by lot to then kill the other men. 1 man was chosen by lot to kill the remaining 9 and then take his own life. Each person's throat was cut to provide a quick and painless death. The last man lit the palace on fire and then ran himself through with a sword.
Much of what we know about the siege of Masada and the deaths of the Zealots comes from the Roman Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish military commander during the First Roman-Jewish War, and according to the story, he surrendered to Vespasian and ended up working for the emperor's family. His writings are the source of important accounts of history that coincide with the New Testament on things like the historicity of Jesus, the historicity of James, descriptions about the temple, and things like that. Josephus is an indispensable resource for information about Jewish history in the first century. But we have to ask the question, is Josephus reliable? If we hold him to the same standards as other historians of the time, I think the answer is yes.
Some have sought to cast doubt on the account of Josephus, who was not an eyewitness to the events at Masada, though he lived in the region as a teenager. However, many things in archaeology serve to confirm his account. When Masada was first excavated in earnest, beginning in 1963, the investigators noticed a strange burn pattern in the many buildings on the mountain. Many of the rooms had the remains of ash covering the floors, but many adjacent rooms did not. Normally, with the presence of so many rooms with a very hot fire, one would expect neighboring rooms to be badly damaged as well. Archaeologists believe this mystery is explained by the missing ceilings. The buildings on Masada were made of stone covered by plaster. The roofs were made of wood, beginning with the beams and then covered with other materials, including wood. The rooms with no ceilings did not catch fire with the other rooms. The rooms that still had ceilings of wood caught fire and burned. The pattern of burning teaches us which rooms the Jews used to mine wooden beams. Many military implements were found strewn over the whole mountain. Arrowheads were found littering the entire mountaintop. Stone missiles, similar to cannonballs, were found in rooms bordering the wall. The Jews carved these 18-inch balls out of limestone to roll down on the Roman soldiers. Additionally, 5-inch dolomite stones were used in Jewish catapults against the Romans. The most striking piece of confirmation evidence was found on shards of pottery. In one room, in a pile of rubble and trash, excavators found broken pottery with Jewish names written on them in ink. One of the names was Ben Yair, the family name of the zealot Jewish leader. More than likely, these were the lots used to determine who would kill the others.
You remember that one of the greatest discoveries at Masada was the discovery, which we know from Josephus Flavius, about the lethal lottery, which all the men, after they killed their wives, they made they all gathered, they made a lottery, and they chose 10 people who should kill all the others, right? And as you know, at Masada were discovered 11 pieces of pottery with names. Why 11? Because also the name of the commander of Masada is there. And there are 11 names, and they are very interesting. And names are, also nicknames, which means it was done just ad hoc for something, for the moment. For example, the man of the valley, the fisher, the man with the curly hair, all kind of nicknames, the son of the baker, names like that. And I found those 11 shards.
Well, when I think about the archaeological evidence that has been unearthed at Masada, and then I compare it to the testimony of someone like Josephus, it really does thrill me to know that here we are some 2,000 years later, and we have at our disposal so much information about the ancient past, in particular, the people of Israel and what they believed religiously and politically. Now, in a very similar way, and this is a very important point, Masada reminds me of things about the Christian faith. One of those things being that we likewise, through the historians of the New Testament, historians like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul, and others, have confirmation then of events and the people of Christianity.
Masada is a testimony to the human spirit. The Zealots believed they would overthrow Rome and that God would give them victory. In the end, they faced the realization that the Romans brought the condemnation of God on people who refused to respond to His call. Many times, people confuse what they want with what God wants for them.
The Zealots of Masada showed incredible faith in the face of terrible odds. In spite of their faith, they expected redemption and salvation really on their own terms. In a sense, they tried to impose their beliefs on God rather than searching God's Word to form their beliefs. Unfortunately, the results were catastrophic.
The Jews and the Romans believed the mountaintop fortress of Masada to be impregnable. They were wrong. No earthly fortress can protect anyone from all enemies and invaders. David also took refuge in the mountains surrounding Masada. But in Psalm 18 he wrote, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies." In contrast to the Jews on top of Masada, David understood that true safety comes only from God Himself. God is the only one who can deliver from any enemy, even sin and death. God is the only source of true freedom. We must put our faith in God alone and in no earthly fortress. Masada stands as a symbol of an indomitable spirit. Herod the Great built a luxurious palace in a seemingly impossible place. The Romans conquered a seemingly impregnable fortress. The Jews refused to submit, even in the face of defeat. But ultimately, they all lost. But they all remind us that true victory is found only in Jesus Christ.
You are the canyon and I am a crevice. You are the heavens and I am a star. You are the thunder and
Rising out of the Judean desert in Israel, there's this gaunt and yet there's this majestic, large outcropping of rock that forms a massive plateau that's known as Masada. Now, as you drive along the western shoreline of the Dead Sea, it's easy to spot this peculiar promontory that looks sort of like a mountain island amidst a barren terrain that has this narrow pathway that snakes its way up from the base to the mountaintop some 1,200 feet above to the peak. And the word Masada is a Hebrew word, and it's often translated as stronghold or something like fortress. It's found several times in the Old Testament, both in 1st and 2nd Samuel and in the Psalms, and it refers to a place where David fled during a time of crisis, and also it's used in the imagery and poetry of the Psalms. Masada truly is a thrilling place to visit. It's thrilling to me not only because of the connection to King David, but also because of the vivid imagery of what a stronghold looks like and how that helps us in understanding more about the power of God. But Masada is also important because of the history that's associated with the Jewish people and their own fight for freedom against the Romans during the latter part of the 1st century. Today, Masada is a part of the National Parks Association, and it's become one of modern-day Israel's greatest symbols of courage and defiance against tyranny. So for me, this place represents not only the courage of a people fighting for freedom, but it also brings to mind many lessons about faith, about hope, and the struggle of humanity to be a people, and the struggle for all of us to walk by faith.
What stood out most in my mind about Masada is that no earthly stronghold is impregnable. They thought it was impregnable. They thought they couldn't be reached there, but ultimately they lost. Ultimately they were defeated. There's nothing on earth that can protect us. There's nothing on earth that can truly keep us safe. If we want actual security, we have to look somewhere else.